Hello guys, hope you're well. Thank you so much for joining me today. So I was actually going to do this video out on location, but literally the weather has been so gloomy here in the UK at the moment, and just, you know, with little chance of light, I thought it'd probably be best just to do it here. So today I'm going to be taking a look at the Fuji 10-24 f4 lens. Now, I've had this lens for just over 3 years, and you'll know if you follow this channel, it's pretty much always in my camera bag. It's a really versatile lens that works well for photo and video and can take a fair bit of abuse, let me tell you. Firstly though, I should mention that there is a newer version of this lens available now, which has a few updates, such as weather sealing, upgraded OIS, but from what I understand, the optics are fairly similar, if not identical. So during the video, I'm going to be taking a look at this lens for video and photography, sharing some images and doing a bit of a sharpness test to see how this lens performs at different apertures. The test files will also be available for you to download should you wish to check out the image quality for yourselves. So before we dive into the video side of things, let's talk about the build quality, you know, the quality of this lens. Well, there's no surprises here. The build quality is, as you would expect from any Fuji lens, completely solid. You know, it's metal construction, but it's got the odd plasticky bit on it, such as the aperture ring. Now, the aperture ring doesn't have any markings on it, which is a little bit disappointing. I'm not sure why it doesn't, because it's, you know, a constant f4 aperture. I would have thought it made sense for them to add the aperture markings on it. It is clicked though at 1/3 stop increments, which is nice for photography. The zoom range between 10 and 24 millimeters offers the full frame equivalent of about 15 to 36-ish. So nice and wide at one end and enough zoom at the other to get portrait shots looking nice and natural. The zoom and the focus rings are nice and smooth, even after 3 years of constant use. The front element does move about 10 mil as you zoom in and out, but this movement is done within the lens casing, so it doesn't affect attaching a filter, which is really nice. The filter is a 72 mil, which matches my 50-140 lens, which is really handy indeed. Down here we have the image stabilization and the auto aperture switches. The front lens element is curved as well, but again, that doesn't really affect attaching a filter, so that's not a big deal. So this lens is not weather sealed, but I have got it wet a ton of times and I've never had any issues whatsoever. But it's definitely not something I recommend. If you did get any corrosion on the inside of this lens, it probably would void any warranty that you would have. All round, the build quality is absolutely brilliant and I can't fault it at all. So let's dive straight into the video side of things. It's quite an interesting one really, because it does do pretty well for video use. It's wide enough to vlog with, you know, if you're holding it, and there's enough zoom to get those close in natural looking shots. Shooting in 4K as well helps because it crops in a bit so you can get a little bit more reach as well. The focusing is nice and smooth, especially if you use the linear manual focusing, and it racks nicely as well if you're setting up with the touch to focus. Doesn't have a huge amount of focus breathing as well, which is nice with that racking of focus as well. The OIS really helps to eradicate camera shake as well when it's on a non-stabilized camera such as the Fuji X-T3. So although this channel is about landscape photography, the majority of my revenue comes from shooting weddings, both photography and videography. But I can honestly say I've never used this lens for my wedding videography, and the main reason for that is due to its f4 aperture. And shooting an aperture of f4 gets pretty much everything in the scene fairly sharp unless you're really close into your foreground subject at f4. So for that reason, it isn't very desirable for me to use it for my professional wedding videography work. So let's talk about the stills side of things, photography. Like I mentioned, I'll be taking a look at some test shots in a bit, but how does this lens actually perform? Well, the autofocus is accurate, but nothing special really in terms of speed, but I would say it does absolutely fine. The zoom range is great as it overlaps other lenses nicely, such as the 18-55 and the 16-80. The optical image stabilization is great for handheld shooting, and the focal length that this lens covers is great for landscapes and architectural work where a wide aperture isn't that desirable. Although this lens does cover one of my favourite focal lengths when shooting documentary weddings, which is 23mm, I rarely use it as f4. It doesn't really offer enough light or enough shallow depth of field for the work that I do. It does come to my wedding photography gigs though, for a couple of reasons. It's really nice for getting, venue shots, and the close minimum focusing distance is great for getting really dynamic detail shots of decorations and that type of thing. The reason I purchased this lens though was for my landscape photography. It makes up the trinity of lenses that I have that cover the focal length from 10mm right up to 150mm, and it does a cracking job of providing me with a good lightweight wide angle solution for my landscapes. So before we go any further, I reckon it's time to do some test shots to see how this little lens performs at different apertures. Now I was really surprised when I tested out my 18-55 in a previous video, so I'm really looking forward to seeing how this little lens performs. So let's get straight into the test. So I've got the 10-24 on the Fuji X-H1 here, and I've got it set up pointing at this little still life setup. Now this is the same setup that I did when I did the Fuji 18-55 lens test. And the reason for that is I want to try to keep all this very, very similar so I can compare the two lenses, because obviously these focal lengths overlap. We've got, obviously this goes up to 24 and the 18-55 obviously goes down to 18mm. So I want to see how they compare. Obviously I haven't really got anything that I could compare this to at the wide end, but we can certainly get a good comparison on the 18mm and say 24mm. So that's what I'm going to do. We'll take a series of shots at this little setup here at varying apertures, and yeah, we'll get over to the computer and see what it looks like. So images are loaded up onto the computer. I've taken a quick look at them because, let's face it, you probably don't want to sit here for hours and hours and hours looking through tons of images. Like I mentioned at the beginning, I've put a pack together that you can go and download so you can take a look for yourself, but I'm going to share my thoughts. Some interesting things have cropped up in this little test, so let's dive straight over to Lightroom and do some comparisons. So here we are in reference view in the develop module of Lightroom, and as you can see I've got the settings that I've used to take the photograph here, and you can easily scroll or toggle on this by pressing I on your keyboard, or just go through the various settings there. So if you do download the files, just do that and you'll know exactly what settings are used for each given photograph. So one thing I noticed straight away, and this is at 10mm, is the distortion that you get with this lens when it's zoomed to its widest. And this is to be expected with a wide angle lens, especially when you get very, very close to your subject. And this is a case of being very close to my subject. I'm here shooting this probably about 300 or 400mm away from this Polaroid camera, and that's why the corners look stretched out and everything kind of looks angled in, and it's not particularly pleasing. So let's take a look at this lens at 10mm, and just to see how it does at different apertures. Now the one on the right here I've got f22, and the one on the left I've got f5.6. So if I zoom in on both of these, now we can clearly see how badly this lens suffers from diffraction when the lens is stopped down at f22. We can really see here how much softer it is and how much less contrast there is in the image. So it really isn't usable at f22. And if I swap it over to f16, we'll see it starts to sharpen up a little bit, but again the contrast is a lot more muted, and again not really usable at f16. Once we get to f11 though, it does start to improve somewhat, but I still don't think I really want to go down to f11 with this lens. I can safely say that between f5.6 and f8 the lens shines, to be honest. And that's pretty much true when we come out to the edges as well. There isn't a huge amount of difference between f5.6 and f8. So I would say that the sweet spot of this lens at 10mm is between f5.6 and f8, and I would be more than happy to use this lens those apertures if I was shooting really wide. My next test was 14mm. Similar to before, f22, f16 was really poor, not even worth looking at in my opinion. And again, f5.6, f11, we start to see that softness creeping in. Switch that to f8, and again f5.6 is slightly better than f8, but we're seeing that it's not too far away now. Over in the edges there, f8's a little bit better than f5.6. So depending on where you look at the image, you're going to see a bit of a difference, but I wouldn't hesitate to use this lens at f8 around about 14mm. So my next test was at 18mm. So let's have a quick look at f5.6 on the left and f11 on the right. Again, f11 a little bit softer, whereas f8 starts to improve somewhat, and it's not a million miles away. Perhaps the contrast is better. When we go over to the edges though, we can start to see f8 is a lot better, and perhaps a little bit more detail in the numbers there. So again, f8 probably would be overall a better option than f5.6. We can clearly see at the edges there it's a lot better. My next test was to test it between the 18 to 55 lens. Now when I did my test before, I was comparing my 18 to 55 and the 10 to 24 18mm and 24mm, but I tested it at f11, and we can clearly see here that it's not at its strongest at f11, so it wasn't probably a fair comparison in all honesty. The 18 to 55 is better at f11, the 10 to 24 is probably better at between f5.6 and f8, so it probably wasn't a fair comparison. So I've done another series of tests so we can really properly compare the two at those different focal lengths and really see where we are with that. So on the left we've got the 10 to 24 lens at 17.4mm, and we've got the 18 to 55mm at 18mm. It's about the same. These are f5.6, so let's zoom into the center and have a little look. And you know, you'd be hard pushed I think to tell the difference at the center there, but once we get to the edge we can clearly see that the 10 to 24, even though it's not great, is a heck of a lot better than the 18 to 55. So let's swap that up to the f8, and again at the edge here we can clearly see that the 10 to 24 lens is better at the edges. So I think it's fair to say that the 10 to 24 f8 is better than the 18 to 55. But I think that's what you'd expect, isn't it really, because the 18 to 55 is right at the end of its zoom range, whereas at 18mm on the 10 to 24 was, you know, somewhere in the middle. So you'd expect that you know, is probably the case. This last test was on the 10 to 24 at 24mm, so right at the end of its zoom range. On the right hand side it's f11, on the left hand side it's f5.6. So let's zoom in and have a little look. I think we can clearly see that f5.6 in the centre here is better than f11, so that's still holding true at f8. I think it's fair to say that there's a bit more contrast in the f5.6. Let's have a little look at the edge. Now this was really interesting. When I took a look at the edges, I was quite surprised how much better f8 is compared to f5.6. We've got all sorts of weird artifacts around the edge of this, kind of bit of a glowing sort of blob of, it's not very pleasing at all. It's clearly better at f8. So even though we have a little bit of trade-off in terms of perhaps the center sharpness or center contrast, it's way better in the edges. So let's just quickly test between the 10 to 24 lens and the 18 to 55 lens. So I think we've established that the 10 to 24 is better at f8. So let's take a look at the 18 to 55 at 24mm at f8 as well. So I think possibly the 10 to 24 is a touch better in the center. Let's have a little look on this lens. Perhaps if anything, the 18 to 55 is a little better in overall contrast and sharpness there. Let's have a little look on the foliage of that. And perhaps the 10 to 24 is a little bit better than the 18 to 55 right at the edge. So yeah, a bit of a strange one. But so my conclusion overall is that this lens is a well-built wide angle option that is well suited to many different scenarios. It will continue to be a mainstay in my landscape photography bag, and I don't think I'm going to update it to the weather sealed version, as this one has done me proud over the last few years. I would recommend this lens if you're into your landscapes and architectural photography, or are looking for a wide angle, lightweight, compact-ish zoom. I would, however, be wary of shooting at a narrower aperture than f8, as this lens really suffers from diffraction. The good news is though that because this lens offers such a wide focal length, rarely do we need to stop the aperture down below f8, as a decent depth of field is easily gained within this focal range. If more depth of field is required, say you have something very close, some very close in foreground, then my advice would be to shoot at between f5.6 and f8 and then focus stack. Another big thing to be wary of is the distortion at the wide end of this lens. If you get too close, expect to see the corners stretching out a bit. Anyway guys, a massive thanks to everybody who made it this far, and as always, a big thanks to everybody who supports me, whether that be by subscribing to this channel or by being a member of my online photography club, links down below and over here. Again, thanks for your support, it's much appreciated. Please be sure to like this video and share it if you think others might like it too, and feel free to check out some of my other videos too for more shenanigans like this. Anyway guys, I'll see you next week.